Ezekiel 33:3.
Okay, welcome everyone to Wednesday Bible Studies. Today we're doing Genesis chapters 18 to 23. So we're going to start off today with a review from last week, and then we'll do an overview of Genesis chapters 18 to 23. If there's any questions from the study or just questions in general, we'll have questions at the end, and you can type them in the chat, and then Jenna can shoot those over to me. And then we'll assign our reading for next week. So review from the last study. We took a look at the genealogy from Adam to the flood. We see the journey of Abram from Ur of Haran, where his father Terah dies. So Haran was his brother. So they ended up going to leave Ur, where Abraham was born, and then they went into the city where his that was named after his brother, and then that's where his father dies. So at this point in the story, Abram is just Abram. It's not Abraham. Abraham is the name he takes upon later. Abram is blessed by the Lord and called to leave and journey into Canaan. So it was at Haran when Abraham had a vision and spoke with the Lord, and then he was told to pick up and leave from Haran and then move into Canaan, as Canaan was going to be a land that he and his ancestors or his descendants would take going into the future. Abram travels to Shechem, which is in Canaan, and builds an altar and then camps between Ai and Bethel. Abram travels into the Negev region and then into Egypt because of a famine that hit the land of Canaan. And then Abram pretends his wife Sarah is his sister in fear that he'll be killed by the Egyptians. So as he goes into Egypt, he fears that the Egyptians won't be God-fearing men and that they would take his wife from him and kill him. So he decided that he was going to pretend his wife was his sister. Next, we see the Pharaoh takes Sarah and is inflicted with diseases. The Pharaoh realizes that Sarah is Abram's wife and not his sister and gives her back to him, as well as maidservants, manservants, and cattle. So amongst the group that was given to Abram, so the possessions and the people, you'll find a woman named Hagar. Hagar shows up a little bit later, and Hagar came basically amongst these possessions that the Pharaoh had given Abram. Abram travels back to the Negev region where he and Lot separate. Lot chooses the land of Zor, and Abram, Mamre, and Shechem. So they have to split. Basically, they have too many cattle, and the people are starting to fight because they can't find places for the cattle to graze. And so the land is very large, and Abraham says, well, Lot, you can choose. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. So what ended up happening was Lot chose the land of Zor, which is land of Edom. Today, you would call it Jordan. And then Abram chose the area of Mamre, which was in Shechem, close to where he built the altar. Lot is taken captive when foreign kings conquer the kingdom of Sodom during the Battle of Siddim. So since Lot went down to this area called Zor, Zor is where you have Sodom, as in Sodom and Gomorrah. And what happened was there were kings, they were squaring off with each other, and the one set of kings defeated the other set of kings, and the outcome was that Lot became a prisoner, taken possession after the Battle of Siddim, when the kingdom of Sodom lost. Then we see Abram hears of his nephew and travels to Damascus to Hobah to save Lot. So Lot, he heard he was taken captive. One of the servants obviously made it back. When Abraham hears the news, he travels north, goes north of Damascus to a place called Hobah, and then saves Lot. Then we see Abram give 1/10 of the spoils to Melchizedek, and he didn't take any for himself. We've identified Melchizedek as a priesthood that's outside of the Levites, though. As a matter of fact, since we're dealing with Abram and we look at the family tree, the priest line hasn't even been born yet. The priest line is the Levites. Normally what would happen is it would go Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob has a child called Levi amongst another 11. Levi is where the priesthood was going through. However, we see that this Melchizedek is a priest. This is a priest that looks like it comes through the bloodline of kings, which we talked about last week with Christ. And we see that Abram gives this priesthood, which is likely Shem, which was the son of Noah. He gives him 1/10 of the spoils and takes nothing for himself. Abram didn't want the king of Sodom to say that the king of Sodom made him rich somehow, so he returned the spoils. Abram is told by God he would be blessed to be the father of many nations. We see Abraham is told his descendants and would be servants in a foreign land for 400 years. So before they would go into their own land and then be blessed, that they were going to be foreigners in a land and be servants for 400 years. We know that comes up later, which is Egypt. And we see that during the times of the Exodus. Sarah is barren, so she gives Hagar, her maidservant, to Abram to have a child. So Abraham's wife, or Abram's wife, she's unable to have a child. She's been barren her whole life. And she makes the decision, since God had spoken to Abram and told him that he would be the father of all of these children or all these nations. It probably wasn't going to be through Sarah. So this is why Sarah decided to give her maidservant Hagar to Abram. Remember, Hagar was picked up when they were in Egypt, and when they were coming back, the Pharaoh had given Hagar, amongst other maid and manservants and cattle. Sarah begins to deal with Hagar harshly, who leaves and is told by an angel her child would have many ancestors. So Sarah, she's jealous, obviously, because Hagar is pregnant. She's having a child, and it just obviously grieves her. And so when she dealt with Hagar harshly, Hagar ends up going pregnant and running off into the wilderness. And while she was in the wilderness, she was told that her child would also be the father of many nations, or would have many ancestors. Then we see the birth of Ishmael, and Ishmael was born when Abraham was 86 years old. And then Abram becomes Abraham at 90. So at 90 years old, that's when you start seeing Abram become Abraham. And from that point on, through the rest of the pages of the Bible, you'll see him referenced as Abraham. It's quite often, actually, you'll see people who wrestle with God, and then all of a sudden they submit, and when they submit, they receive a new name. We'll see it a little bit later with Jacob, and in the book of Revelation, you'll also see the same thing. Abraham receives the covenant of circumcision. This was the physical circumcision. We talked also about a circumcision of the heart, which is in the New Testament. Sarah is told that she'll have a child in a year's time who will father 12 princes. So the 12 princes were referring to, obviously, not Isaac, but later down the line with Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, and those 12 sons are the 12 sons of Jacob, or the 12 sons of Israel, as Jacob is later renamed to Israel, the same way that Abram is renamed to Abraham. And then Ishmael and Abraham are circumcised. Ishmael, just so you know, Ishmael is the father of Islam. So Ishmael, there's basically 12, I believe it's 12 Qurayshi tribes that connect you down to Muhammad. So that number 12 that shows up with the 12 sons of Jacob also shows up with the 12 sons of Ishmael. So both Ishmael and Jacob obviously go on to have a very large nation. So genealogy of Adam, from Adam to the flood. We'll just do another quick review here. We have Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. So Cain kills Abel. Then we have Seth. We have these two bloodlines, one coming through Cain, the other one coming through Seth. The first city in the Bible was called the city of Enoch. City of Enoch is believed to be the city of Uruk in Samaria. Under Cain, that's the Enoch on the Cain side. We also looked at Enos, E-N-O-S. This is memorable because in Genesis 4:26, we find that all of a sudden people start using, instead of the name Elohim, we see the name Lord or Yahweh, or which later is called Jehovah. First time it shows up in the Bible is in Genesis 4:26. And when we took a look at the 1611 King James Version, we found that Genesis 4:26 wasn't people proclaiming the name of the Lord, but in the crib notes or side notes we saw in the King James Version, it said that people were calling themselves by the name of the Lord. So in other words, people were making themselves into idols. And we've studied that on the Sabbath, where there are religions where people have obviously called themselves gods. In the days of Jared, in Genesis 6:4, we see the sons of God come unto the daughters of man. We've defined the sons of God, or B'nai Elohim. Those are angels. We see those same angels actually mentioned in the book of Job with the same terminology of B'nai Elohim, the sons of God. So during the times of Jared, we know that something happened. It was something that obviously changed genetics. We saw this new offspring, which were called the Nephilim. So the Nephilim were the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of man. And then in the days of Noah, which is just obviously a few generations after this, we see the destruction of the world. So it's quite likely that something that happened in the days of Jared led to the destruction of the world, because the people became full of iniquity. And we find that in books like the Book of Enoch, the angels or sons of God, called the Watchers, taught people these types of iniquities. Actually, they taught them technology. They taught them things like how to make swords, women how to do their makeup. They taught them how to do things such as clothing or judging what the weather will be by looking at the clouds. These were all things referenced through the book of Enoch. So in Genesis 6:8, we see Noah, and Noah has his three children, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So after the flood, these are the only people that exist in the world. So when we take a look at the world, we always look at Shem, Ham, and Japheth and then break it down from there, because that's all that was left on the other side of the flood. We're going to take a look now at an overview of Genesis chapter 18. So Abraham returns Lot home. So we leave off in Genesis chapter 17. You basically see that Lot gets taken captive. There were these two sides battling at the Battle of Siddim, and the outcome was the winners basically took the spoils and the people and then brought them north. And so north in this case was Hobah, which is north of Damascus. And so Abram goes up and ventures up north of Damascus to return Lot back to his home. And if you remember, Lot's home was in Sodom, or the land of Zor. So Abram set up camp in Mamre, and then Lot set up his camp in Zor, which is Sodom. So if you take a look at the map here, you can kind of see the Dead Sea in the center, and then you can see Beersheba, and then to the right of Beersheba, Jordan, and so on. So Lot was basically positioned at the very south here of the Dead Sea. We have Abram. Abram was in Mamre. Mamre was the place with the great oak trees. So we have Lot on basically the south side of the Dead Sea, and then to the west of the Dead Sea, we can see this is where Abram was in Mamre. And then we take a look here. The next thing that happens is the Lord visits Abram at Mamre. And so we can see here basically Abram sitting under this oak tree, and then he gets three visitors that approach him. We find out later who those three visitors are. In Genesis 18, 1-8, I'm just going to read this because it's actually very important. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre in the heat of the day, while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent. So here we're seeing the Lord is actually manifesting to Abraham. It's not in a dream. Abraham is awake, and he's coming to Abraham's physical tent. And Abraham looked up and saw three men standing nearby. So the Lord wasn't alone. It was the Lord with two accomplices, or two visitors with him. When he saw them, he ran to the entrance of his tent and met them and bowed down to the ground. "My Lord," said Abraham, "if I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought that you may wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a bit of bread so you may refresh yourselves. This is why you have passed your servant's way. After that, you may continue on your way." "Yes," they replied, "you may do as you said." So Abraham hurried into the tent and said to Sarah, "Quick, prepare 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it, and make some bread." Meanwhile, Abraham ran to the herd, selected a tender, choice calf, and gave it to a servant, who hurried to prepare it. Then Abraham brought curds and milk and the calf which had been prepared, and set them before the men, and stood under the tree as they ate. When the men got up to leave, they looked over Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them off. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation. Through him, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. For I have chosen him, that he will command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord, by doing what is right and just, in order that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has promised." Then the Lord said, "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great. Because their sin is so grievous, I will go down to see if their actions fully justify the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will find out." And the two men turned away and went towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. So the two men that were with God were actually angels, and we learn of this in the next chapter, which is Genesis chapter 19. You can actually see different frescoes of this too. So here's actually a depiction of the Lord and the two men that were with him meeting Abraham in Mamre. And you can see here that in this mural or fresco, they're depicted as angels. So the Lord visits Abram at Mamre. In Hebrews 13:2, we also see, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." So we can see in Hebrews that angels can look exactly like we do. We can't really distinguish between ourselves and them in some situations, and this would be one of them. And we can also see in Genesis 19:1 the confirmation, because the two men that left from Mamre that went to Sodom, we can see here in Genesis it says the two angels arrived in Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. So we can clearly see the two men that left from Mamre are the two angels that arrived in Sodom at Lot's house. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and then go on your way early in the morning." We saw Abraham spoke with the Lord and asked if Sodom would be spared, or if there were righteous people. So as the two angels left, the Lord was still there, and the Lord spoke with Abraham, and Abraham had this dialogue with the Lord. And he's basically asking if there was anyone righteous, would he destroy Sodom? And the number started off high, and then it started to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And the reason why is because Abraham recognized that the Lord wasn't going to justify righteousness by anything subjective. The righteousness was going to be justified by the laws of the Lord, which later we know as the Ten Commandments. But at this period of time, obviously, it was a little bit different with Abraham. You'll hear of a term used, used quite often in Judaism, which is the seven Noahide laws. Seven Noahide laws actually show up in a different book. They're not necessarily explicitly called the seven Noahide laws, but they're laws that were given to Noah, which show up in books like the book of Jasher. Abraham would have been familiar with that, and so of course, knowing that Sodom would have been judged based on these laws, he knew that there was no one righteous by that standard. And this is why, with the conversation between the Lord and Abraham, the number of how many righteous people that would need to be in Sodom for the Lord to spare it became smaller and smaller, because Abraham realized by the standard of righteousness, there just simply was no one there. Interestingly enough, the word sodomy, if you look at the etymology of it, which is sodomia, is actually going all the way back to the Bible. So you can take a look at the word sodomy and look at its etymology. It will actually point you back to the book of Genesis, chapter 19. And sodomy in this case implies men practicing homosexual rape. And we do see that actually in chapter 19. So in Genesis 18, we see that Abraham encounters two men. We find out later those men are angels, and the Lord paying him a visit at Mamre. So this isn't a vision. This is actually in person. This is in the awakened conscious state. And we also see that Abraham serves them bread, a calf, cheese, and milk. Typically, if you're sleeping or if you're dealing with a celestial being, they wouldn't be eating something solid unless, of course, they themselves were solid. So again, we're dealing with something that is taking a physical form. Abraham is told Sarah will have a son within a year when he returned. And the he in this case, we're not sure exactly who's being referred to as one of the three, whether it's the Lord or the other two angels. It's one of the three who made the comment that when they returned, Sarah would have a child. Sarah laughs at the idea that she will have a child at 90 years of age. That's how old Sarah was at that period of time. Abraham is told he will be a great nation in which other nations will be blessed. Abraham is told that the Lord will be going down to Sodom and Gomorrah to see how wicked the people are. So basically, as they were going through Mamre, and Abraham had offered to feed them and clean them as they passed through, Abraham came to learn that basically they were just swinging by on the way to Sodom to see how wicked the people were there before the Lord would deal judgment upon Sodom. So kind of what you saw before the flood. You'd see a situation where there was an examination, and typically there was a warning beforehand and then a judgment. So we're seeing that same blueprint, that same diagram. Abraham watches the two men leave and then go towards Sodom and Gomorrah. So again, since we can see the two men are leaving towards Sodom and Gomorrah, they arrive at Lot's house, and we find out these are two angels. The Lord and Abraham talk about the judgment coming upon Sodom. And Abraham asks the city be spared if so many righteous people were found. So again, it's not just like instant judgment. There's always a period where there's a delay, because the judgment is, the destruction comes following the judgment, sorry. So you always find that there's a period of judgment first, and then if the period of judgment finds the people to be guilty, and obviously they're continuing in their ways, then you find the destruction. And then we have that final dialogue actually in Genesis 18, where Abraham asks if the city will be spared if so many righteous were found. Then we go into Genesis chapter 19. In Genesis 19, we see the two angels come to the house of Lot in Sodom. So the two angels appear at Lot's house. In Genesis 19, 1-4, it says, Now the two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When Lot saw them, he got up to meet them, bowed face down, and said, My lords, turn aside into the house of your servant. Wash your feet and spend the night. Then you can rise early and go on your way. No, they answered, we will spend the night in the square. But Lot insisted so strongly that they followed him into his house. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Before they had gone to bed, all the men of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called out to Lot, saying, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Send them out so we can have relations with them. Some translations, you'll see the word, so we can know them. In the Bible, when they use the word know, to know someone, that means to have sex with them. You'll find that the Israelites or Hebrews, however you want to define them, when it came to anything involving sexuality and sex in general, it was something quite sacred. So you'll find that even with the choice of words that's used in the Bible, it's very, very conservative. The men of Sodom want to have sex with the angels. So, of course, the men of Sodom aren't seeing these men as angels. They're just seeing these men as men because, of course, angels can look like men. We see that many times in the Bible. So in this case here, the men that the people of Sodom want aren't really men at all. They're actually angels that were with the Lord and had came with him to Mamre. In verse 6, it says, Lot went outside to meet them. So Lot goes outside the door, obviously, to confront the men. Shutting the door behind him, Please, my brothers, he pleaded, do not do such a wicked thing. Look, I have two daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them to you, and you can do to them as you please. But do not do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof. Get out of the way, they replied. And they declared, this one came here as a foreigner, and he is already acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them. And he pressed in on Lot and moved in to break down the door. But the men inside reached out, pulled Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. And they struck the men at the entrance, young and old, with blindness. So they wearied themselves trying to find the door. So here we can tell for sure that we're not dealing with just normal men, because of course normal men can't strike anyone with blindness. So here we see the angels strike the men with blindness. And actually, as a matter of fact, when you take a look at this story, it does show up also inside of the book of Jasher. And in the book of Jasher, you just get a couple extra details having to do with the story between Lot and the angels. But in this situation, again, the people in Sodom, you can tell, they can't tell that these are angels. These just look like men to them. So you can see Sodom really does live up to its name because they obviously want to have forceful sex with these angels. It's obviously not going to be with the angels' consent. It goes on and says, Then the two men said to Lot, Do you have anyone else here, a son-in-law, your sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we are about to destroy this place. For the outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that he has sent us to destroy it. So here you can see that Lot is being informed by the angels what the plan is, and this was the same communication that was told to Abraham. Again, in the book of Joshua, when it describes this scene, in the prior scene where you have Abraham basically pleading with the Lord to preserve Sodom and Gomorrah if it's righteous, there's a little bit more to that story where Abraham actually pleads that at least his nephew Lot is spared. So in the Bible, you see in Genesis that it talks about, well, what if there's 30 people, can they be spared? What if there's 10 people, can the city be spared? In the book of Joshua, it actually goes on and says, well, can you spare my nephew Lot? So at that point, Abraham recognized that there was no one who was righteous in Sodom, and he just pleaded that his nephew could be saved. So it carries on and says, so Lot went out and spoke to the sons-in-law who were pledged in marriage to his daughters. Get up, he said. Get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But the sons-in-law thought he was joking. At daybreak, the angels hurried Lot along, saying, Get up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. But when Lot hesitated, the men grabbed his hand and the hands of his wife and his two daughters, and they led them safely out of the city because the Lord's compassion was for them. So here we have the son-in-laws, so Lot's daughters, their soon-to-be husbands. Lot tries to get them out of the city, and they won't listen because they think that he's joking. So they end up being destroyed. So his two daughters, his wife, and they all leave the city, and Lot is being pulled out by the angels. So the angels we see in the scene blind the men, and then they take the angel, and then the angels take Lot out of Sodom. Lot's wife looks behind as they leave, and then Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt, and the city is destroyed. So at this point, all we have now is we have Lot and his two daughters, his wife, and obviously the sons-in-laws. They have all been destroyed with the city. So as the three leave, we see in Genesis 19:27 to 28, some details from Abraham's end. From Abraham's point of view, it says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. So you'll notice here I highlighted the wording smoke like a furnace. Here's a depiction of Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed. So basically fire rained down from the sky, fire and brimstone, and the sulfur obviously had destroyed the city, and there was great smoke that was seen in the air. That word choice, though, of great smoke shows up in Revelation 9:2 as well. Revelation 9:2, it says, as it opened the tunnel, smoke poured like the smoke of a great furnace. The sun and air turned dark because of the smoke. So this is actually when the bottomless pit in Revelation 9 is opening. But I was thinking it's quite interesting because, of course, what comes out of the pit are the locusts, and the locusts are looking for people without the seal of God on their head. So it's like a judgment. And again, you have this great smoke and a judgment. And with Sodom and Gomorrah, you have this theme again of great smoke and a judgment. So I just thought it was kind of interesting to point out the choice of words that we saw back in Genesis. Once Lot and his two daughters leave, they go off into a cave. And Lot's daughters recognize the fact that without the mother present, there's no way to preserve the bloodline of Lot. So the two daughters make the decision to get their father drunk, and they sleep with their father, and they produce two offspring. One of the two is called Ben-Ami. This goes on to be called the tribe of the Ammonites. The Ammonites actually show up later in the Bible several times, and the Ammonites are not following the God of Israel. The Ammonites have their own separate God. Another child that was born was Moab, and Moab is known as the Moabites, the tribe of the Moabites. Again, they had a separate God. They did not follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you look at the map here, you can see here's the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is a little bit later in time. But you'll notice on the east side of the Dead Sea, you'll see Moab. And then a little bit higher towards where Gad was, you'll see Ammon. So these are the Moabites and the Ammonites on the map. They're actually very close to Israel. If you take a look at the map on the right-hand side, where you see the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah later in time, you'll see they still existed. They were the kingdom of Moab and the kingdom of Ammon. So the deity that was worshipped by the Moabites worshipped a god that was called Shamash. Shamash shows up in 1 Kings 11:7 and also in 2 Kings 23:13. Often when you see Shamash, you'll see a goddess that shows up with Shamash. The goddess was Astarte. We know that Shamash existed because Shamash shows up on the Mesha stele, also known as the Moabite stone. Mesha stele is also known as the Moabite stone, a stele dated around 840 BC, containing a significant Canaanite inscription in the name of the king Mesha of Moab. So again, we can confirm that these people actually existed because we have this stele that's left behind. And on the stele, actually, we can tell not only that they existed, but the Moabites had a god that was known as Shamash, and Shamash shows up in the Bible as well, recorded as the god of the Moabites. In 1 Kings 11:7, on a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Shamash, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So here we can see Lot's two children, which really they shouldn't have existed because Lot was supposed to be destroyed. All of Sodom was supposed to be destroyed. It was only because of compassion for Abraham that Lot was really spared, because clearly we can see the outcome with Lot is we had two children that were born, and they were born by the father sleeping with the daughters while drunk. And then the outcome is we have two children go off to worship two different gods. One child worships Shamash, the other child worships Molech. Molech was the god that was associated with child sacrifice as well in the Bible. If you take a look here, we can see the god of the Ammonites. So we see Moloch of the Ammonites. Moloch is infamous for the child sacrifice, where they would basically have a giant idol. The idol would be typically made out of metal, a brass probably. And then what would happen is they would take the infants, they would place the infants into the hand of the idol once the idol had been heated. And then at that point, what would happen is the priest would bang on a drum, and the drum sounds would basically drown out the screams of the infant that was in the hands of the idol. So this came from the Ammonites. Again, this is Ben-Ami. This is one of the children of Lot. The other god was Shamash. Shamash, from my understanding, was actually a solar deity, and Shamash was the deity of the Moabites. So in Genesis 19, we see the angels come to see Lot at Sodom and Gomorrah. The angels tell him that he needs to leave because the city will be destroyed. The men see the angels enter Lot's house and want to have sex with them. Lot offers his daughters, but the people want the angels. The angels blind the men outside of Lot's door. The angels take Lot outside the city, warning him not to look back. Lot's wife looks back and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Lot's daughters get their father drunk, and they father 2 children with him. Ben-Ami is the father of the Ammonites, and Moab is the father of the Moabites, and both of which have their own deities, which are not the God of Abraham. Genesis chapter 20. In Genesis 20, we found that Abraham moved from Mamre to Negev, living between Kadesh and Shur. For a while, Abraham stayed in Gerar. Abraham told the king that Sarah was his sister. So again, we see the same thing that happened in Egypt. This time, when Abraham is in the land of Gerar, which is a Canaanite land, he's in the land of Canaan. This time, he says that his sister is his wife, is a sister, because he is concerned that the king is a godless man. And so he figured once again that the king would kill him and take his wife. So he made his wife say that again she was a sister. So the king is Abimelech. Abimelech is the king of Gerar, and he ends up taking Sarah. God then appears to Abimelech in a dream and says that he's a dead man and to return the wife of the prophet, or else the king would die. Abimelech returns Sarah and asks why Abraham would say that she was his sister. And technically speaking, Sarah is actually Abraham's sister. Abraham explains that his wife is the daughter of his father, but not of his mother. So that's how Sarah is actually his sister. Abimelech gives Abraham sheep, cattle, and slaves, and told Abraham to live wherever he chose on the land. And Sarah was told that Abraham would be given 1,000 shekels to clear the offense. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and female servants, because we find out that one of the things that was inflicted to Abimelech was that he lost the ability to conceive. So the female servants, his wife, and Abimelech, they were all healed. So now he could once again conceive children. Then we go into Genesis chapter 21. In Genesis chapter 21, we're seeing Isaac, and Isaac is being weaned. And while Isaac is being weaned, we see that the other child who was born earlier, which is Ishmael, who would be 13 at this point, Ishmael is mocking his younger brother. When Ishmael mocks his younger brother, the wife Sarah gets very offended by this, and she decides that Ishmael and Hagar need to go away. So Hagar flees to the desert, and she brings her child with her. There's actually a scene where Hagar's in the desert. She runs out of provisions. So she was given food and water by Abraham. She eventually runs out of water, and she fears that her child is going to die. So she sits by herself and weeps because she doesn't want to watch her child die. And at that point, she encounters an angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord tells her that her child is going to also be the father of many nations. So the same promise that you see being given to Isaac is being told to Ishmael as well. What seems to be a little bit different, though, is the blessing. Ishmael was not told that he was going to bless other nations. Isaac was told he was going to bless other nations. They were both told they would be blessed, though, with a great deal of ancestors. The area in which this happened was called Beersheba. Beersheba we see a little bit later as well, but basically when Hagar is looking for water, a well appears in front of her, and the well was in Beersheba. So Beersheba means well of 7. It's a place in Negev. Well of seven, or another translation, which I think is more appropriate, is the well of oaths. It also shows up in the book of Jasher. So this was the well where there'd be basically oaths that were taken. Well of seven, one of the reasons why it takes this name seven is because of how many sacrifices were done there. So when you're reading the details regarding a peace treaty that was between the king of Gerar, Abimelech, and Abraham, you'll see that number seven show up with the sacrifice. So in Genesis 21, Sarah gives birth to Isaac as God promised a year prior. Isaac was circumcised at 8 days old, which was the tradition that was obviously developed in Abraham's time. Abraham was 100 when Isaac was born. Ishmael was 13. Sarah was 90 when she became pregnant, and then later obviously gave birth to Isaac. Abraham held a feast when Isaac was weaned. Ishmael was mocking Isaac, and Sarah told Abraham to get rid of her, and Ishmael would never share in the inheritance of Isaac. Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael off with food and water, and they went down to the desert of Beersheba. When Hagar ran out of water, God spoke to her and promised her that her child would be a great nation. She opened her eyes and then saw a well of water and gave Ishmael a drink, and this is the well of Beersheba. Ishmael grew up and he was an archer, and while living in Paran, his mother got him a wife from Egypt. We see that there's a peace treaty that's between Abraham and the king of Gerar and Phicol, the commander of the king's army, and the well received its name from the peace agreement. So again, the Beersheba, the well of Beersheba, the well of oaths, it's because they made an oath that as long as Abraham and his ancestors had existed in the land, that they would be peaceful amongst the Canaanites. So in this case, the king of Gerar, and I guess this would kind of overlap it with the Philistines. Genesis chapter 22. In Genesis 22, God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on a mountain in the region of Moriah. Abraham brought Isaac and 2 servants 3 days' travel to the mountain. He left these servants behind and then took Isaac with him forward. Isaac obviously noticed that all the provisions were there for the sacrifice with the exception of the lamb. So Isaac asked, "Where was the lamb?" And Abraham responded, "God would provide." Abraham then ties Isaac to the altar, and before he kills him, an angel of the Lord spoke from heaven and stops him. Again, in the book of Jasher, you'll find more details about this. You'll find Satan actually disguised as a man in the book of Jasher and trying to thwart them on their way to do the sacrifice. Another thing you'll also get from the book of Jasher was you'll find more of a conscious awareness with Isaac. Isaac wasn't completely unaware that his father was going to sacrifice him. It wasn't like his father just put him on the altar and it dawned on him that he was going to be sacrificed. As they approached this altar, or as they approached the area where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, Isaac becomes fully aware that he is going to be the sacrifice. And in the book of Jasher, it goes on and Isaac says, well, I trust my father and I trust God. So he allows himself to be killed. It doesn't happen though, because there is an angel of the Lord that stops it at the very last second. Basically, the confirmation was just to see whether or not Abraham would sacrifice his child. Now, if you take a look forward into the New Testament, you'll realize this is actually really pointing towards Christ. The same way that Abraham was about to sacrifice his son Isaac, God actually sacrifices his child Christ, Jesus. So Abraham, obviously being a man, he doesn't see the sacrifice of his son, but actually it was really pointing towards the archetype in the future of where Christ would be sacrificed. So at the last moment, what we find is that a ram is caught by its horns in the thicket, and then Abraham uses that as a burnt offering instead. And so Abraham calls the place the Lord will provide. So again, what we're talking about is the providing of his son, right? The atonement of sin through the blood of the Savior. The angel called from heaven and told Abraham, since he did this, he would be blessed to have many descendants, as many as the stars in the sky and the sand on the shore. All the nations will be blessed through his offspring because Abraham obeyed his God. And then in the last part of Genesis chapter 22, Abraham has 2 brothers. One's Haran. Haran is already deceased. And then, of course, Lot was his son. That was the son that Abraham had taken with him on his journeys. And then Abraham's other brother was Nahor. And we see Abraham's brothers, Nahor's lineage mentioned in the end of Genesis 22. Then we move into Genesis 23. In Genesis 23, we find out that Sarah dies. Sarah dies at 127 years of age. And then Sarah is actually buried in Ephron's field in Machpelah. So basically, what happens is Abraham needs a place to bury his loved ones. He speaks to the people and basically tries to negotiate an area where he can bury his loved ones. They offer the area that he wants is a field. It's Ephron's field, and there's a cave in Ephron's field. Basically, Abraham speaks amongst the people and asks for this land and that he'll pay for it. And Ephron actually offers the land. And when you read it, it sounds like Ephron was actually just going to give him the land. He said what the land was worth was 400 shekels by basically the merchant's price. But it sounded like Ephron was more than happy just to give him the land. But Abraham paid the price in full of the 400 shekels. And then this is actually mentioned many, many times in the Bible, going through the Old Testament, where this area here specifically becomes a burial place for many of the Old Testament many of the early characters in the Old Testament. So first we see Abraham's wife is buried here, Sarah. As a matter of fact, today, what you're looking at, this building, this is it. It actually exists. This area, this cave where the bodies were buried, today it's a tourist site. You can visit it. It's actually located right here on the map. So you can see it's right beside the Dead Sea, not too far off Jerusalem here. It's in the west, I'm trying to remember the West Jerusalem or West Bank, sorry. It's in the West Bank area. So in Genesis 23, we find that's the end of Sarah's life. Sarah was outlived by Abraham. So Sarah lived to 127. She died at Kiriath Arab, means Hebron in the land of Canaan. Abraham bought the land from the Hittites to bury his wife. He bought the cave in the field of Ephron and Zohar, the cave of Machpelah. So Zohar, obviously this was very close to the area where Lot was. Abraham paid 400 shekels of silver for the land. Ephron's field and Machpelah near Mamre, both field and cave in it. So he didn't just buy the cave, he bought the field, and the field had a cave within it, and the cave was where they were burying everyone. The cave became deeded to Abraham as a burial site. So you'll see future generations when their fathers would pass, for example, Jacob, he was buried in the same cave. So before we go into the reading for next week, I'm going to show you something that has to do with Sodom and Gomorrah, the actual location of where Sodom and Gomorrah is supposed to be in the world. So we were looking around the Dead Sea. So let's take a look. In Genesis 13:10, it says, Lot looked around and saw the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, so in chapter 13, we're looking at this place, the land of Zoar. Land of Zoar is well watered. We can see that it's near Jordan. We looked at a map earlier to kind of see where this was. We're talking the south of the Dead Sea. That's where Jordan was, southeast of the Dead Sea. This area here is where it's believed to be Sodom. Has a very high level of sulfur. And these caves here, they believe, are some of the what was left of the houses that were remaining in Sodom and Gomorrah. So they thought they discovered this biblical city of Sodom and Gomorrah in 2015. I've seen several other articles about it as well. But one of the reasons why they think they've discovered it is, one, the location, but secondly, the incredibly high level of sulfur that was found in this area. So of course it was supposed to be raining down fire and brimstone. So we're talking sulfur. Well, this area is the highest level of sulfur, but not just the highest level of sulfur, the highest purity of sulfur anywhere else found in the world.
Welcome to the Holy Land and this biblical site of Sodom and Gomorrah. I have to tell you, I have been waiting a long time to do this video. This is absolutely staggering. We've traveled the Holy Land. These are the believed sites of Sodom and Gomorrah. There is some discrepancy as to where they might be, but the evidence is so overwhelming that right here, this is where Sodom and Gomorrah is. I have been absolutely impacted and impressed by this. It's just, I mean, right now I just feel just a sense of awe over me right now as we're here. And as we go through this video, you're going to see some amazing things. You're going to see some sobering things. We're going to talk about the evidences of why we're in the biblical Sodom and Gomorrah. And you're going to see some scripture as to what God did here and how Sodom and Gomorrah is a future looking forward to God's judgment to come. The actual location, as we mentioned, is a little bit disputed, but there is growing evidence that these locations are Sodom and Gomorrah. And we're going to look at the evidence, and then we're going to look at some scripture. So Josephus, a Jewish historian writing around the time of Christ, said during his time that you could still see the evidences, you could still see Sodom and Gomorrah clearly, that they were still visible. Now we have to understand that Sodom and Gomorrah existed about 4,000 years ago. So 2,000 years after Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Josephus writes that you could still see the cities visibly. So we're 2,000 years beyond that. But we also have to understand that when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, and it appears to be the surrounding cities in this Dead Sea region, that he reduced them to ashes. Now what we can see here is a lot of brimstone here in this area. So I'm going to talk about some of the evidences. So Josephus says he could see the cities clearly. They have discovered in these areas a brimstone, and they're like balls. And this brimstone is totally different than any other place on the planet. Most other brimstone, and I should mention brimstone is synonymous with sulfur. So brimstone is kind of the old word for sulfur. So we have found sulfur balls all over in these city areas here, and it's unlike any other sulfur on the planet, as I mentioned. They're white, and they are about 90 to almost 100% pure. So you can light them with a match and they burn this deep blue, yellowish color, just burning the rocks. It's just almost solid sulfur. Now most sulfur found around the world is greenish and runs about 40 to 50% in sulfur purity. So we have these sulfur balls here that are unique. They're round and they are almost pure sulfur, and they're white like any other place on the planet, as we mentioned. Also, archaeologists have discovered in these areas around Sodom and Gomorrah about 1.5 to 5 million bodies in graves in these areas around Sodom and Gomorrah. That tells us that this area was densely populated. Also, we know when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, he sent fire, so I'm sure there was a lot of tumult and buildings falling down and stuff like that.
Just stuck out on the side of the Dead Sea, and was sort of recently discovered to be here, and you can just see all over here is just ash. This is just ash, just crumbles, and you can see the layers. We can see evidence right in front of us here of God's righteous judgment, his power, his might, his glory, that this place was utterly destroyed by fire raining down from heaven.
You can see, of course, the swirling in the rock, which would have been caused by the intense heat.
So evidence like that, it makes it really difficult when you look at this to say that this is just some kind of a fairy tale. I think it's really important that we help kind of ground things that we find in the Bible with as much history and archaeology as we possibly can. Just quickly reviewing the history and archaeology we saw today already. We saw the Mela stele, or the Moabite stele. That confirms the Moabites existed, also confirmed that their God existed, and we find the Moabites and their God listed in Genesis of the Bible. We also saw the place where the many of the Old Testament characters were buried. That still exists today. It's a tourist distraction. And now we saw around the Dead Sea, in the area where we suspect Sodom and Gomorrah is, the highest level of sulfur, or at least the highest concentration of sulfur found anywhere else in the world. And those structures, you can clearly tell those were structures at one point in time. Keep in mind, you're looking at what's left of something from 4,000 years ago. And you can still clearly tell that those are man-made structures, even if you're trying to guess at whether it's a wall or whether it's an idol or whatever it is. So evidence of Sodom, meteor blast, cause of biblical destruction, scientists say. So science catches up, and science tries to keep its own when it comes to the Bible. Instead of saying that God destroyed the world with raining fire and brimstone like we read in the Bible, scientists come up with another theory, because they are aware that there is a high level, obviously, of brimstone, which is sulfur, at these sites that were believed to be Sodom and Gomorrah. So they've come up with a challenging theory to obviously take away credit from God and then just make it a natural occurrence, which is a meteor. So next week, our reading is going to be Genesis. We're going to be on chapter 24, reading all the way through to the end of 29. If you have questions either from today or you have questions for next week you can always mail them to questions@ezekiel333.com. Shoot them in before Monday, and then I'll put some slides together for the coming Wednesday study.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.